Dr. Mujib Abed from University of Melbourne. Floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. Assalamu alaikum, Bahamagi. It's a privilege to see you all, especially to hear that there are friends of ours in the audience who are joining from Afghanistan. Yeah, look, so my contribution to the edited volume was a chapter titled Unlocking. Sharifisa, did you say introduce ourselves as well? Sorry.
I know that's very late for you, and it's probably like 4 o'clock in the morning for you. So my apologies, we completely understand. So feel free.
No, that's a good course.
You want to take your time.
Yes, my name is Mujib Abed. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Melbourne. The Initiative for Peace Building is the name of our unit here. And I have a bachelor's from the American University of Afghanistan in political science. So, you know, in a lot of these conferences, I meet faculty, current faculty from AAF, which is always lovely. I then have a master's from Sydney Uni in Peace and Conflict Studies, and have done my PhD at University of Queensland. And my PhD thesis explored the politics of modernist power and politics of resistance in modern Afghan history, essentially. I attempt to theorize, you know, enactments of modernist power since the colonial encounter, making my way all the way to the war on terror and the post 9/11 Afghanistan. And so this chapter that Anna Larson, Omar Sharifi, and Dipali were very kind, and their you know, their imprints are all over this as they helped edit and support me in putting together this chapter and getting it to the finish line. It is very much you know, a continuation of my ongoing interests in relation to Afghanistan. And yet also, as Anna mentioned there earlier, it is also, I think it captures a certain anxiety that we all were sensing and grappling with, a moment of reckoning in a way. And of course, it hasn't gone anywhere, right? But when I wrote this paper, or when I wrote its initial draft, it was, you know, very much immediately after August 21. So I think some of those anxieties are present now that I've revisit the chapter and read it a little more closely after a while. And there is room, certainly I'm self-aware, I suppose, reading it, to, you know, to push some of the nodes of the argument and see where things stand now, a little while after, since the analysis kind of, my lens stopped observing. Anyway, so the chapter Unlocking the Taliban Puzzle, Traditions and Fundamentalism. So I do a couple of things here, or I try to do, right? So I say that first we need to treat Taliban as a theoretical phenomenon. It can't be this sort of aberration, this exceptional moment, or this exceptional political turn that has no place in Afghanistan's post-colonial historical chronologies. I mean, to me, that doesn't help us at all. We have to attempt to locate the Taliban within a broader post-colonial historical chronologies of Afghanistan, specifically within the trajectories of Afghans themselves experimenting with nationalist ideas, right? So to me, you know, throughout the 20th century and then into the first, you know, two and a half decades of the 21st century, Afghanistan has been the site of these intense, unfortunately, often violent contestations over what the imaginaries of post-colonial, you know, Afghanistan should I want society and state should be or should contain, and so Taliban is very much part of that chronology. So I kind of, to set up the argument, I do two things. On the one hand, there is the historical kind of setting of the timeline, if you may, and so in the chapter I go on to discuss, Afghan nationalism, the different expressions that or different forms and expressions that it takes in the post-colonial period or since independence, let's say since 1919. Whether it is young Afghans, wishes Ilmiyan, or how then some of those ideas around Afghan modernism then gives rise to a fundamentalist Islam on the one hand, and a fundamentalist version or articulation of Marxian politics on the other hand, and within that pantheon is there, of course, liberalism as well. So I paint this, I attempt to paint this picture whereby I say that these different ideological projects in their own ways have all tried to graft Islam onto a state form, but of course they do it from different registers. But Islam is always this kind of this ever-present category. It's just that their interpretations of Islam are quite distinct. So on the one hand, that's important, right? Because an analysis, academic or scholarly treatments of Afghanistan, I mean, historical amnesia is something that we all have to deal with. I mean, and there's a lot of reasons why that tends to happen or has tended to happen. But we have got to deal with that, I think, head on. We have to be able to locate our analysis within a certain geo-historical locale, right? So that's what's happening. On the other hand, there is the theoretical debates underlying what's going on. So Taliban as a phenomenon, as a political organization or as a movement, or now as a state, masquerading as a state or a state indeed. Theoretically, how do we how do we go about it? So I one can look at it. There are these questions we can ask: or Taliban, or the Salafist or Wahhabist movement, or they some form of a peasant movement, or they some a student movement? What's going on? But I think one way to look at it that I think is a little more helpful is to ask whether the Taliban are a modernist movement or a traditional movement, right? And there is a lot of reprieve in staying with that question, I think. So I, in the paper, use Sayyid Hossein Nasr's sort of typology of political Islam. So to Nasr, political Islam could be categorized into one of three. There's a triad that he paints. So we have modernist Islam, we have fundamentalist Islam, and we have traditional Islam. And he goes on to say that often from a Western perspective, political Islam is seen as a binary of either a moderate Islam or fundamentalist Islam, right? So a favored moderate Islam, which is what basically it's Islamic modernism that goes back to the colonial period, or a detested fundamentalist Islam. But Nasser says, well, hang on a minute, that's a bit problematic, because we are just wholly abandoning or deliberately erasing another form of political Islam, that is traditional Islam, whereby we are not just looking to the exteriority of religion and faith, but this esoteric turn of Islam, and unpopular customs, and localized attempts at organization, negotiation of power and organization of society, right? Socialization of power. He goes on to locate that. Of course, that's just his body of work is all about championing this traditionalist Islam, right? In tasawwuf, in irfan, in ma'rifah, in Islamic art, Islamic philosophy, Islam, a plurality of views and perspectives and epistemologies within Islamic history. So he just goes on to sort of champion that. And I say that it's important to look at Taliban vis-a-vis in relation to this triad, right? This triumvirate. And the conclusion that I draw is basically, and this is the dilemma that lies at the heart of the Taliban and a lot of the decisions that they make, that's difficult to make sense of, and it comes across as so, frustratingly irrational and self-defeating, even as a movement, if you want to look at it, or try to look at it, the Taliban movement as a rational actor. It's just self-defeating. What's going on? But of course, for the Afghan people and for even the regional countries and global community, it's a big challenge, and it's not always easy to predict the next move when it comes to the Taliban. And of course, has been very violent and repressive as well. So I go on to argue in the paper that within the Taliban, there lies a dilemma. And dilemma is born of the fact that within this triumvirate of political Islams, or just, let's say, Islamic perspectives on politics and society and state, the Taliban disavow one. So they are very much anti what Nasser calls modernist Islam. But then they embrace the other two, and they do it all at once. They do it simultaneously. Within the Taliban, one can find a certain commitment, enduring commitments to fundamentalism. At the same time, there are certain enduring commitments and historical and cultural proximity to traditional Islam. Okay, and this is what creates all this confusion. This is what creates all these contradictions. Hence, the difficulty to predict the next move, the difficulty to really map out exactly what the movement is, and so on and so forth. And so within the chapter, then if then one wants to look at the Taliban closely, well, there has to be a framework, or there has to be a certain method to the madness, right? So I then divide, or I then kind of approach it from two perspectives. I look at the Taliban as an insurgency, or as a movement on the rise, and then I look at Taliban as the emirate, right? Either of the versions of the emirate, whether it's late 90s or the post 2021 August 21 iteration of the emirate. So essentially custodians of the state, and at least from my readings, what emerges is that as an insurgency, the Taliban seems to be closer to its traditional sensibilities and Islamic worldviews, and that results in additional or more forms of localization of power, of decentralization, of de-hierarchization, of a less than willingness to embrace the officializing and bureaucratizing and type of almost even territorializing impulses that a modern nation state, or a modern state, I shouldn't call it nation state, a modern state obviously inherently has those impulses, right? It bureaucratizes, it officializes, it expands, it controls and expands territory, right? It's territorializing in that sense. So there's more of an the movement tended to lean more during the insurgency against the Western powers, even in the lead up to taking of Kabul in 1996, and the way it positions itself in the paper I talk about, in the way it positions itself on the one hand in relation to village identity in mid-1990s, and then on the other hand in relation to established Islamist political factions in Hizb Islami and Jamiat Islami, and how it represents itself as champion of some form of an authentic, indigenous Islam of Afghans, one that it claims has been dismissed and has been pushed to the margins. And here we are coming back, and this is it's almost like a backlash against that form of modernity that was embodied in political Islam on the one hand, and in Afghan socialism, or just socialism on the other hand. So that's the rise, and then we see it throughout the insurgency as well. There are examples of different consensus and leadership and decision making. Again, de-hierarchization, right? But then you use that the other side of this coin is once they start taking control of the state, and when that happens, because of the contradiction that lies within the dilemma to, on the one hand, stay committed to traditional Afghan sensibilities, whereby the state has had little space, right? It's not an imaginary that gives much attention to, or has a lot of really respect for a modern nation state. So when you want to then hold that knowledge perspective or that worldview simultaneously with the reality, everyday reality of having to manage a state, having to govern through the mechanics of a modern nation state, we then see increasingly Taliban turn inwards. I think the sentence that I used somewhere there is that they abandon a commitment towards native priorities once they control the state for an exclusionary form of nativism. So increasingly, we see Taliban turn nativist, and what that means is an inward-looking and a willingness to submit to the power of the supreme, so autocracy, and obviously increasingly repressive policies, decree-based governance, and there's a bunch of other things I mentioned, but there's one discussion that maybe is worth mentioning, and then I'll stop at this, and it has to do with constitution. And so there I tried to juxtapose some conversations that were there in the 90s, in 98 and onwards, around the adoption of a constitution, and there is this sort of phantom document that supposedly was in existence. There was a constitution supposedly, but was never made public because the regime fall. And then in 2005, there's supposed to have been, the terms of which was confirmed, and some of which was communicated to the fighters through the Laiha, the famous Laiha, that the Taliban wrote and circulated amongst its fighters. And then where we are after 21, where initially there was some chatter, some murmurings of internal conversations, at least around the constitution, but then that seems to be now just brushed aside. Sharia is superimposed on, and is supposed to have taken over entirely, such that there is no room for any other form of a foundational document to the current iteration of the emirate. But then I go on to say that there is a certain tension within the Taliban. So, and that I kind of speculate what might be causing this this hesitance to go all the way towards embracing this this debate around the need for a constitution and why it might not be so keen on drafting one, even though, of course, without it, it's very difficult things have to think that there's that. So look, I guess I'll leave it at that. Maybe the last point is, speaking of Taliban in these terms is important because we can't give him totality, right? We can't. Maybe there's a claim within the movement for, sort of this. If you listen to the movement and its ideologues, of course the Taliban has absolute power in Afghanistan. There's a totality, or there's a totalizing impulse within its ideological prism, and that's just the fact of life. But I think we have to poke holes within its within its outlook, within its project, because it's this ambivalence within the movement would then allow for resistance, with dissent, whether it's discursive or whether it's resistance in other forms, in more material or embodied forms. There's no power that is absolute. And Taliban is not an exception by any stretch of the imagination. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much once again. I'm sorry if I don't have slides to guide you as well, but thank you very much for this opportunity to once again talk about this paper. And to the editors, thank you for your excellent work and bringing us together.